Now, turn off all the lights and get ready to never sleep again.
Never Turn Away a Guest by Tsarslavyan.
My family came from a small village in the old country, the kind where traditions that we call cute or folksy today were followed to the letter. Even though my parents immigrated to the country where I now live for years before I was born, my childhood is filled with memories of my parents telling me what to do or not do for some strange, arcane reason. Not that I'm complaining, of course. Some of these traditions were fun, especially as a kid. I never had to make my bed before school, because doing that gives you bad luck, and I would never know when I'd have a pop quiz. On nights before I had a big test at school, Mom and Dad would make me a big bowl of porridge and jam, and I would stick my face in it for good luck, as they would laugh and hug me, even though I'd make a mess of their clothes. Of course, other superstitions were less fun or more confusing. Don't whistle inside the house. You'll lose all your money, Mom would say. Don't put keys on the glass table, Dad would say. Go put bread in the neighbor's yard so that the birds will circle their house instead of ours, Dad would also say. They're not our people. It won't affect them, he would say with a smile and a wink. The one tradition that they held far above all the others, though, was to never violate guest rights. Anytime anyone would show up at our front doorstep, neighbors, Girl Scouts, missionaries, whoever you can imagine, they would be invited inside and immediately presented with a plate of bread and salt, water, and polite conversation, as well as anything else they might ask for. It often made for interesting, if not awkward, situations in our family home. Eventually, I grew up and left my parents' home for college, and every time I would come home for a visit, I would be greeted with a plate of homemade bread and salt and warm hugs from my parents, asking me to tell them crazy stories from college. When I eventually got engaged, I brought my future wife, Lindsay, to my parents' home to find them waiting for us at the front door. My mother holding that same ornate plate covered with bread and salt, and both of them telling my fiancé in their broken English how happy they were for the both of us. Years after I had gotten married, my wife had told me the great news that we were going to have our first child. Towards the end of her pregnancy, my parents came to visit so they could be there when their first grandchild would be born. And this time, it was my turn to greet them with bread and salt. The bread was store-bought, and the salt was that cheap discount kind that you can get at the bottom shelf of a grocery store. They smiled, dipped the bread into the salt, and ate it happily before hugging and kissing me. Even after all these years, I was still their little boy. My daughter, Lily, was born a healthy girl. I was always convinced she was special. She started to smile far before any baby would, and always seemed to be so alert. I was convinced that she would grow up to be some kind of genius. After a couple of months of raising our child in an apartment, we decided it was about time to find a real house for her to grow up in. We went out into the country, and after searching around, we found the perfect house for us to raise Lily in. After negotiating and closing, we found ourselves moving everything that we owned into our new house. From first glance, everything seemed ordinary. The houses were nice and spacious, and each property had a couple of acres to it. The neighbors were close by, but not so close that you felt smothered or that you were being constantly watched by someone in the neighborhood. It was all to change when we had our first visit from a neighbor. Lindsay was cradling a crying Lily, trying to get her to sleep, when the doorbell rang. Not wanting to risk the doorbell being rung again and possibly irritating Lily further, I went to answer it to see a man wearing country clothes and a cowboy hat, accompanied by a woman, who I assumed was his wife, holding a dish of some kind. I opened the door and stepped out. Howdy there, the man said, extending his arm for a handshake, which I accepted. My name's Victor, and this is my wife Marlene, he said, introducing himself. Hi, I said, obviously tired from the move and from taking constant care of Lily. I'm Sasha. Sorry, my wife Lindsay is inside with our baby. Oh, don't worry about it. The missus and I know how it is. We have 3 of our own, Victor said in his loud, booming voice, throwing his arm around his wife, who was smiling uncomfortably. Now, I won't waste any more of your time. We just came by to drop off this casserole to welcome you into the neighborhood, Victor continued as Marlene extended her hands to pass me the casserole dish. It did smell great. At that point, my upbringing kicked in. Would you like to come inside? I asked. Lindsay would kill me for letting anyone in while we were still unpacking, but I just couldn't bring myself to break this superstition I was raised with. After escorting Victor and Marlene to my kitchen, I put out a plate of bread and salt. I got confused looks from them, but they subsided after I also put out some water, whiskey, and the casserole that Marlene had made. We made small talk for a bit, and at some point Lindsay did come down with Lily to meet them. After another half hour of some awkward getting to know each other, Victor and Marlene got up to leave, saying something about getting some housework done before the week started. As Marlene left, Victor told her to go ahead so that he could tell me about something that he had forgotten to bring up. Marlene became visibly uncomfortable and left without another word. Victor turned to me, and the large smile he had on all afternoon had left. Now, there's something you should know about this neighborhood, he began. It's very safe and has the nicest folks you'll ever meet, but every now and again, he trailed off, not knowing exactly how to continue with what he wanted to say. Every now and again, something comes by. We're not exactly sure what it is, he continued on. I didn't understand what he was saying. What do you mean, something? I asked. Well, that's just it. We're not sure what it is. It ain't human, I can tell you that much, Victor explained. Is it some kind of animal? No, it's hard to explain, really. It ain't anything natural, I can tell you that much. Now, the important thing to remember is that it'll never hurt you or anything. It only comes around once in a blue moon, and it'll just kind of knock at your door. When it happens, I usually just pull the blinds down and turn the TV volume up. It goes away eventually. At that point, I had no clue what to say. I just stared at Victor as if he would burst out laughing, saying that it was all just a joke that they liked to play on the new neighbors. He didn't, though. As we just stood there in silence, he gave me a pat on the back and walked out the front door. We never brought it up again. Life moved on and we got settled into our new home, and we even became good friends with Victor and Marlene over the next few months after our initial encounter. Lily kept growing, and I could have sworn that she looked more and more like her mother every day. As we neared her first birthday, Lily started to become fussier and fussier. At first, we chalked it up to things such as teething or nightmares, but it only became worse and worse. Then, on the night of her first birthday, we awoke to shrieks coming from her bedroom. We raced to her crib and found her crying. With nothing, we tried soothing her. It became very obvious to us. She was in pain. We raced to the emergency room, where they took us in and ran all sorts of tests on our girl. After what seemed like an eternity of waiting, a stern-faced doctor walked into the room. He asked us to sit down. I can't remember the start of the conversation. All I can remember is the word that caused the world around us to crash. Cancer. He went on to explain how the x-rays had shown a rather large, highly inoperable tumor on Lily's brain. He went over our options, explained to us that it was within our rights to try chemotherapy, but given the size of the tumor as well as Lily's young age, how it was almost certain to not have an effect. After the doctor left, we sat in that hospital room in silence for what appeared to be hours, then silently packed up our things, took Lily, and drove back home in complete silence. As soon as we entered the house, Lindsay left for our bedroom and shut herself in there, while I set Lily down on her baby chair in the living room, after which I sat down in the kitchen and fought back tears. I sat there all day, barely moving for hours, getting up only to use the bathroom and to soothe or feed Lily when needed. This painful routine continued for days, with hardly a word being spoken in the house. I was beginning to wonder if mine and Lindsay's relationship would be able to survive. I called my parents in tears, and they promised that within a few days they would be there to help us out. On the 7th day after Lily's diagnosis, Lindsay was in the bedroom as per usual, while I was sitting at the kitchen table staring at nothing while Lily was sitting in her baby chair in the living room. I hardly even noticed that the sun was setting until the bottom floor of the house was pitch black. As soon as I had flicked the light switch on, I heard a knocking at the door. I was in no mood to entertain visitors, so I just sat back down at the kitchen table. The knocking wouldn't stop. 1 minute, 2 minutes. After 3 minutes, I had lost my patience completely, and I got up to tell whoever was at the door to buzz off. It had been a while since I had actually spoken, so as I walked up to the door, I carefully rehearsed in my head exactly what I would say. Once I had turned the knob and opened the door, I stopped dead in my tracks, with my mouth agape. What stood there was definitely not human, or at least not anymore. It had 2 arms, 2 legs, a torso, and a head. It also had a mouth, but no eyes or nose. It wasn't wearing any clothes, and all its flesh was a blackened color and appeared to have a slimy texture. Whatever it was, it gave off a foul stench, so much so that it took every ounce of strength I had to not vomit right there. I stood there in front of this creature for I'm not entirely sure how long. Once I had come to terms with the fact that this wasn't a nightmare or hallucination, I tried to figure out what to do. Should I go get the neighbors and ask them to bring their gun? I thought. Should I run inside, lock the doors, and hide? I continued to stand there and think, half expecting what it was to at some point just lunge at me and kill me on the spot. To this day, I am not entirely sure what caused me to do what I did. I must have been insane. I must have thought that my daughter is going to die anyway and that I might as well go too. Instead, I just stepped back past the doorway into my house, never taking my eyes off the creature. Once I was in the house, I stepped to the side and gestured with my hand. Come in. The creature took a few steps, slowly at first, but then picked up the pace to the point where it walked at the speed of a normal human, and then made its way past the doorway and into my house. I'm insane. I'm insane. I'm insane. I kept thinking to myself as I walked into the kitchen, feeling the creature's presence behind me. I turned around, and there enough, it was standing in my kitchen, having followed me in. Hands trembling, I reached into the cupboard and took out the old plate that my mother had gifted us when we had gotten married. From the pantry next to the cupboard, I took out a few slices of black bread and poured a generous amount of salt onto the unoccupied portion of the plate. With my hands still shaking and salt spilling from the side, I set the plate down on the table in front of where it was standing. It didn't take any of the bread or salt, and I wasn't even sure whether it could eat, to be honest. At that moment, Lily started crying. With everything that had been happening, I completely forgot that she was still in her baby chair in the living room. I saw the creature move its head in the direction of the living room. At that moment, I had started to regret what I had done. Even if my daughter was terminally ill, I didn't want her to die like this. For what seemed like an endless amount of time, the creature had its head turned towards the living room, listening to Lily's cries. I was ready to attack at any second if I saw it move an inch in her direction. Instead, it slowly turned its head towards the plate of bread and salt, took a slice of the bread and ate it in one bite, baring its rotten, yellow teeth. Once it had finished, it turned its head in my direction, gave me a nod, and headed in the direction of the door. The moment it stepped past the doorway, Lily's cries stopped, and I watched it disappear into the darkness. I stood there stunned, not knowing exactly what had just happened. After coming to my senses, I ran to close and lock the door and grabbed Lily. When I had picked her up, I had noticed that she was smiling. It was the first time she had smiled in weeks at this point. I cradled her the entire night, expecting her to start crying from pain again at some point, but she didn't. As the days went by, Lily seemed to always be in a pleasant mood. Soon it came time to take Lily into the doctor to examine our options once again, with Lindsay joining us. I decided not to tell Lindsay what had happened that night, figuring she was burdened with enough as it was. For the first time since we had gotten the terrible news, we appeared to be a family again. We sat in the waiting room, expecting to hear bleak news once again. When the same doctor emerged from before, he didn't have the stern face he had the past week. Instead, his face was visibly confused. Complete remission. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The doctor explained how they had run each test 3 times to be completely sure, because they had no clue how it was possible. A tumor that big to just disappear within a week was supposed to be impossible. We returned home that day with our happy, healthy girl with a new outlook on life. Lily is now almost a teenager, and I'm grateful for every day I have with her. I won't pretend to say I have all the answers of life. I don't know if there's a God. I don't know if there's an afterlife. But I can tell you this: never turn away a guest. Greetings, spoils and ghouls. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss out. If you have a request or suggestion, make sure to leave them in the comment section below. We hope you enjoyed this video, and remember to stay spooky.